Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the PurpleDon Enlightenment Hour. I am Morgan, the PurpleDon, whatever the hell you want to call me today. And in this episode, we're going to do something a little bit different, especially considering what we've done lately on the Enlightenment Hour. But joining me today, I have my good friend and good friend of the show, Nolan Dean, to talk about why he is a writer and writing things and what he's doing at the minute with writing and what inspires him to be a writer. Hopefully we're going to get somewhat deep into the psyche of Nolan Dean, why he's a writer. But yeah, here he is. How you doing, man?
I'm doing really good. And, as being part of a writer, you have to imagine that you're going to be published at some point and some handsome guy is going to be interviewing you. So I've been preparing for this in my head ever since I started writing my first book.
Oh, well, I don't know what to make of that. Number one, apparently I'm a handsome guy. Not sure about that one. Number two, the interviews you will have to partake in when you are a published writer, I doubt they'll be this silly.
Well, who knows?
Because, well, I don't know. They might be. But okay, why don't we just start off by asking the simple question, the title question, but and then we'll just get sort of deeper into that. Nolan, why are you a writer?
Well, I've always loved storytelling. Like ever since I was a little kid, the first time I ever got into reading was J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and obviously, that's become a big, huge worldwide phenomenon with the movies and the books. And I've always I've been thinking of stories in my head ever since I grew up. I tried to write scripts when I was at least 10 years old. I've been writing my own stories. And the thing about writing for me is that I read to kind of be inspired, because I think stories have this power to help you understand like real life problems and applying them with like fantastical situations that can make it more fun. So it's kind of like learning, but doing it in a fun way. And my favorite writers all do that. I mean, J.K. Rowling did that with Harry Potter. Stephen King does that with a lot of his books. And more recently, who I've been getting into is Neil Gaiman, who is so great at transporting you to other worlds and giving you these really fun, larger-than-life characters. And more recently, because I'm getting really hyped for the movie that's coming out, Ian Colfer's Artemis Fowl series is something that I wish I read as a kid. So as a writer, I kind of want to give kids nowadays the kind of stories that I had when I was growing up and the kind of stories that I wanted to read when I was growing up. Because the best writing advice I've always gotten that if you want to write a book, you should think of the story that you want to read and then go write it.
That's a very good answer. I like that answer a lot. I actually do remember owning at least one Artemis Fowl book, and I don't think I ever picked it up as like an 11-year-old. So we'll move on from Artemis Fowl. But I think you talk about this whole idea of almost escapism into some sort of fantastical world that the reader would want to be in, as opposed to what they're actually in. I think that's obviously a reason why so many people love escapist films and stuff like that can transport you to any sort of world. That obviously sci-fi fantasy genre is built around doing that somewhat, but obviously in books and with reading, it sort of has that. I don't want to necessarily use the word deeper, but it goes into more detail, shall we say? And that that's a thing with books anyway. That's why you will get the books are better than the film brigade, of which you are a part of.
Only for a couple. I think Jaws and Psycho are both improvements upon their books, but I'm sorry, Stanley Kubrick fans, The Shining book is better than the movie.
What about Clockwork Orange?
Clockwork Orange, I think they're both as good as one another.
What about The Godfather?
I haven't read The Godfather.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, but I think books definitely do take. Well, they're far more detailed than the films that come from them. In that sort of fantasy, escapist type way. Do you think that's why books for you speak to you more, because they do take that extra layer?
I mean, it's part of that, and the fact that when you're reading a book and you're looking at all the prose and the dialogue and the characters, you can always tell that it's the author's vision that you're reading. And when you translate that to films, there's like a ton of people working on movies, so many cooks in the kitchen, as opposed. And most times it turns out great. I mean, I love the Harry Potter movies. I've been rewatching them this week. But when you're reading Harry Potter, it's completely J.K. Rowling's world that you're in, and she makes sure that you see that, especially with how bloody long Order of the Phoenix is.
Well, it's not as long as some of Stephen King's work.
Oh, I could go on about that.
I know you are quite the King fan. Please, I will allow you time now to go on about Stephen King.
Well, Stephen King's a different kind of writer than someone like J.K. Rowling is. I liked J.K. Rowling because she took me to a world with a character that I instantly related to. But Stephen King is a guy who will come up with the most ridiculous concept and still make it work. Like, Pet Sematary is a ridiculous concept. It works. Christine is a ridiculous concept. It works.
Yeah.
It, in the book, is such a ridiculous concept, but it works. And that's because Stephen King's just so passionate about storytelling, and you can really tell that in his words and the worlds that he creates. They don't always translate to film very well, but the books are always fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's talk for a couple of minutes maybe about It, because I know It is an excessively long novel. Do you know how many pages exactly it is? Because I've got around like 1,600.
I think it's a bit less than that. It's like, depending on the copy you've got, it's around between 1,300 to 1,500.
Oh, but see, it's ridiculous.
It is.
You can't put that. You can't put everything in there into a film, and It still, from how long has it been out now? A month and a half, nearly. The 2017 remake of It. It's still being talked about. I think it's still pretty high in the box office.
Because they take the best parts from It. Because the whole story of it's not really about a scary clown or this like demon kid. It's about the Losers Club, and Stephen King pours paragraph after paragraph into making sure that you care about each member of the Losers Club, and that's something that I think translated to the film very well.
Yeah.
And for me, I know you didn't find It particularly scary, but what made that film scary for me was that I was scared for the characters because I had grown to care so much about them. So that's the kind of approach I take when I do writing.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, for me, It was much more a coming-of-age film than it was or even, I'll say, story. Not that I've read it. From what I gathered from the film, it is more of a coming-of-age story than a full-blown horror, let's scare people. And that was for sure my favorite part about this new film. I imagine that's, well, you said it's sort of the same in the book, and I think it's nice that you sort of take that on board with your own writing, because to build characters rather than sort of, I don't know, maybe tone I think because characters clearly are important. If you've got a character in a novel or a novel series that people will enjoy, that people will enjoy reading about, that people will relate to, then it's just easier to. It's almost easier to sell that story rather than something that is just fully sort of tone based.
Yeah, I mean, and I can go back to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone with that. Do I like that book because it's got an incredibly complex and detailed plot? No, it's a simple fantasy plot, but I love that story because Harry Potter's such a great character, and you really grow to love each character at Hogwarts and in that world, and that's what makes you come back and go read Chamber of Secrets, go read Prisoner of Azkaban, and so on and so on. And I think when you write a great character, it gives you the chance as a writer to do whatever you want with them. I think that's, you know what, Raul's going to love this. That's why Supernatural has been on for so long, because people like Sam and Dean as characters, not because the plots are becoming more complex and interesting. It's because the characters are becoming more complex and interesting.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that's sort of a clear, at least for me, it seems like a clear difference between something like a lengthy hundreds of pages long novel to a short story of 5 pages, because short stories, at least in my experience, tend to very much focus on scenario and tone a lot more than they do the characters, because obviously they've not got the time to really delve into characters. I'd like to ask you what sort of, like, I know you are a big character fan. You like the idea of creating a character. You like the idea of deep layered characters. But are you a fan of the sort of shorter, sort of stick in your head, tone based, scenario based stories as well?
I do, and that comes a lot from the only experience I've really had with short stories is like from creepy pasta and things like the Russian Sleep Experiment or Smile Dog, where they're not really character based, but you like you say they are scenario based, and those always stick with you. And you know, writing those is very different because the thing about writing a short story is like you don't really have enough time to develop a character as much as you would want to, but you have to develop them enough so that the reader can sort of see themselves as that character. And then usually with those kind of stories, it ends with a complete like punch to the chest, and you suddenly realize what the whole thing's about. And for that reason, I don't tend to go into short stories as much because, oddly enough, when you have less to work with as a writer and you have to write less, it's actually more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why I kind of like short stories. And to be honest, the novels I've read, I've enjoyed as well for the most part. But I think I do like short stories because they seem, I don't want this to come off the wrong way, they seem almost more creative and just sort of, I think it's because they only have a certain amount of, pages or a certain amount of words to actually completely tell a coherent story, that the writing just has to be spot on. And especially for me, I'm obviously a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe and people like that. And of course, he's a major, major name in just literature in general. But I think that's why I like him so much, is because even though he goes into so much detail sometimes, it can take him 3 paragraphs to say a sentence. And that's what I sort of love about him. For me, I know people that can't stand that sort of stuff, but it seems more creative for me, and it just brings out the whatever he's talking about in whatever macabre short story he's telling. It just brings that out right, right to the front. I mean, I think of the Telltale Heart, for instance,
A great story.
and it's not obviously it's not a long story. It's a short story. It's maybe, I don't know, in my copy I think it's about 4 pages. And he does take this very, very descriptive approach to just sort of what's going on in the guy's head. In what in a novel I think would be said in a paragraph can be said by Edgar Allan Poe in something like that in 5 paragraphs, and it doesn't ever feel like it's dragging for me. I don't know what your thoughts are necessarily on the sort of overly flowery descriptive style of writing, but I personally am quite a big fan of that, because it just, I don't know, it feels more, it always provokes a reaction from me when I'm reading one of Poe's stories, because I just think that is a phenomenal way of describing something. But that's just me.
I can go from that saying that prose and writing that kind of stuff has always been difficult to me. But I think with any kind of story, not just with a short story, you have the potential to really create that world from that prose. And books don't have the advantage of visual mediums like film do. So you have to describe what the visuals are like and what the guy is thinking. Whereas I think that's more easier to pull off in a film because you can do great shots with it and you kind of get the point off quicker to keep the pacing going. In a book, you want to be invested in that. And Edgar Allan Poe is a great example. He does that perfectly. And it's not necessarily, I would say, I don't think long prose is just a thing for short stories. I mean, I've seen novels that do that. And they're all the more rewarding for it, because even though some people might be like, oh, okay, let's just get back to the stuff that's going on, please. You have to take a moment and be patient with it, because writing a book is like, it's like you have to put all these ingredients into, say, baking a cake. Mm-hmm. And if you take out certain ingredients, you're going to get a less tastier cake.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a great analogy. I love a good analogy every now and again. I think it's just my sort of tendency. I've always loved the idea of setting a scene. I've always had ideas myself of how to write a nice setting the scene piece, but then go nowhere with it because I don't think about actual story. I think I'd be a fantastic writer if you told me to look out of this window next to me now and you said, describe what's going on in 2,000 words. I think I could do it. I wouldn't create a story from it, and I think you would create a story from it. I think that's an aspect in which we differ, and I'm by no means any sort of writer, unlike yourself. But I find that interesting.
I mean, different writers have different strengths, and you like them for that exact reason. I mean, someone like Stephen King is great at creating characters, but sometimes when you're reading his books and he's going too much into the description, you see that he's not as great with that as he is with writing characters. But with someone like Edgar Allan Poe, maybe the character is somewhat abstract, and there's a reason for that. It's so you can sort of see yourself in that scenario. And when you're reading his prose, it's almost tricking you into thinking you are that character, and that's why you get such a reaction from it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Do you think it is sort of your being that people like Rowling and people like King are sort of inspirations to you, and they are so good with characters? Do you think that is why you do focus on character quite a lot? Do you think that is why that is your main?
I think so, yeah, because to me, characters are stories, and reactions from characters and how characters make a choice, that is where the conflict really comes from. I mean, if you set out to write such a complex plot, but you forget about your characters, you're going to end up with something that people don't really remember, because they're just going to be spending all their time trying to work out what you were trying to say, that they'll forget that they were supposed to be entertained with a character's journey. And it can go the opposite way too as well with characters. If you make something too character focused and there's nothing really there for a reader to latch on to, that can end up boring them as well. So I try to have like a nice healthy balance when I'm writing my stories now.
I'm sure it's quite difficult to actually make that balance, though.
Very, very much so. I mean, I've been through so many different drafts of the story I'm working on alone. I don't even want to talk about the drafts about the stories that I've done years prior because they're probably terrible.
Well, why don't we talk about what you are working on right now? I know it is it's a book called Moonflower.
Indeed.
What is Moonflower?
Well, Moonflower actually, it was previously called the Moonflower Child, but I've since changed that, just calling it Moonflower, and I have the synopsis right here, so...
Please go away. Not go away, go ahead. Don't go away. Oh, dear.
Okay, so do you know what middle grade refers to when you're talking to a book genre?
Middle grade? This is where my literature inferiority comes into play.
So middle grade is sort of like aimed at ages between, say, 8 to 12. That's kind of what Harry Potter is. That's like what Neil Gaiman stuff is. It's not, and that's different to YA, where you get into more like teen romance and drama and stuff like that. But this is a middle grade one because I don't like writing about that kind of stuff.
In between a children's book and a young adult book.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Got you.
So, Moonflower, here's the synopsis for you. 11-year-old Millie Robertson only read about the great adventures from beyond her bedroom window. She never thought for a second she would be living in one. On a fateful summer night, Millie follows a bright light in her garden that whisks her away to the strange land of Vicatio Valley, where she meets an elven princess, Jade, and a handsome inventor, Zigzag. They tell her of a great evil soon predicted to destroy their kingdom and a prophecy that hints to Millie being the savior. Rather than rise up to this terrifying challenge herself, Millie asks for her favorite fictional hero, Moonflower Jones, to be brought to life to save them. However, Millie will soon learn that there is more to Moonflower than what resides within the pages of her story, and it's about to be unleashed.
Oh, unleashed. Oh, that sounds sinister. What I really like about that is reading that synopsis. Towards the start, it's got this fantasy element that you were talking about before it, but then it's got that in the last sort of few sentences. It takes that extra layer that I was thinking. She asks for her favorite fictional character to be brought to life in order to fulfill a prophecy that in so many fantasy books, films, whatever, it's always the main character that has to do this. Even with Harry Potter, with Harry Potter, Harry is has the prophecy. But in something like this, she says, "No, I've never actually come across that before. Someone just saying, no, I know someone who could do this better." And it's fictional, and it brings this more sort of fantasy element to it. And then with, again, the additional layer of, is the character of Moonflower all that the protagonist thinks she is? That could be a nice dynamic there. So I like this sort of... I like the layers this is going. This is far from... It seems like it's far from a simple story, which is, I think, exactly what sort of a longer, more novel type story should be.
Yeah, and with writing Moonflower Jones specifically, first of all, I know the commenters are going to say this. Moonflower Jones is a stupid name. That's the point of the character. She was meant to have this kind of generic-sounding hero name, something that an 11-year-old might actually just like, because they're not at that stage where they're looking for more developed stuff. They just want to be entertained. And the main thing with Moonflower that I wanted to do was... this character, you've heard a lot about debates around what a strong female character entails, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, a strong female character is someone who will make the right choice and does struggle and is not just like emotionless. Like that's what makes Rey a strong female character to me. That's what makes Hermione Granger a strong female character to me. They always make the right choice. Moonflower is a strong female character in all the wrong ways. She's just massively skilled, is incredibly seen as like cool, but she has zero compassion for other people. It's sort of like it's a me against the world kind of thing. And for that, I wanted to write a character that kind of reflected the writing process. And this is where I can go really deep with it.
Please do.
When I wrote my first story when I was about 17, it was called I'm No Superman. And the reason I was writing this story is because a few weeks prior, I had broken up with my girlfriend. And I was just in a completely lost and alone place. And I wanted to do something to take my mind off it. So I came up with this character who got superpowers, but he didn't want to become a superhero. And even as I'm writing this character, I intended it for it to be like a Peter Parker kind of inspiring character, but I'm realizing this character I'm writing is very cynical. And I'm not even trying to make him cynical, but it's just sort of my mindset reflecting onto him. And there's a whole thing with Moonflower that it's not just her favorite fictional character, it's something that her dad wrote for her. Okay. And her parents are kind of like separated, so when he was writing Moonflower, even without him realizing it, he was actually writing a completely cynical person trying to be a hero. And imagine, Morgan, I want you to imagine that, say, you were a fictional character in a story.
I often believe that I am.
Imagine that everything you've ever achieved, all the pain you've gone through.
Okay, that's a lot.
That was all written and chosen by somebody else. You had no control over it. Wouldn't that drive you nuts?
This seems like one of those questions that people ask, like, is the entire world just in the mind of a giant somewhere? Or are we all living in a turtle's dream? Or something along the lines of that sort of nonsense. It's quite terrifying, really. The idea that you have no control over your own life and it's all planned out.
Yeah, especially with somebody as arrogant as Moonflower Jones, who takes pride in being a hero, and she's almost got this kind of thing where it's like hero syndrome. She needs to be seen as a hero to other people because it's what drives her self-confidence. Without that, she's just like any other person in that story. And I did have this thing where she does have like a sort of generic backstory, like her parents died and everything. And there's one scene in the story where Moonflower's showing her true colors to Millie Robertson, and Millie's trying to like beg her not to do anything bad and says, your parents died in an accident, you don't want to do this. And Moonflower's response to that is probably one of the scariest lines that I've written. In stories, there are no accidents.
Okay. I've got to admit, I do like where this is going. I like where this is going a lot. I have one question. Is Moonflower Jones Anakin Skywalker?
I've never thought about it that way, but I suppose she's got bits of that. Yeah, she's got bits of Anakin Skywalker in her.
Guy who just wants to be a hero, doesn't get the very cynical guy, likes himself a lot.
I never thought of Anakin Skywalker, no. What? I never thought of Anakin Skywalker. My main inspiration for Moonflower was like characters like Katniss Everdeen and Mulan, but take away the compassion that they have for others and just focus on their skills. You have kind of a hollow person.
Anakin Skywalker's a very skillful guy.
Oh, yes, he is. And goes down the wrong path.
Anakin Skywalker also has a young female apprentice who looks up to him. Like Moonflower does.
Mm-hmm.
My mind immediately went to Anakin Skywalker. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if this has completely thrown you off.
No, I've actually never thought about that.
Yeah. Please, anyone listening to this, did you hear Anakin Skywalker as well? Or were you thinking more along the probably more sensible lines of Katniss Everdeen without the compassion?
Yeah, well,
No, I don't really know.
I mean, already that shows you what Moonflower as a character is like. That to different people, she could mean different things. To an 11-year-old girl, she's the greatest thing in the world. To someone like you, she's someone who could go down the wrong path.
To someone like me, she will become Darth Vader.
Yeah, I do play with that parallel in the story as well.
That's good though. I think that's good that even like I hope this makes sense, but I think it's good that I thought something that you have never even thought about before, because that for me shows a sort of a very, very layered, sort of complex, interesting character.
And based on what she's like just as a sentence, like arrogant, egotistical, to add that sort of layer that she's just damaged and hates that her own destiny is being written for her, that's where you can kind of see where she's coming from. But I didn't want to make Moonflower necessarily a sympathetic character all the way. She's more like a dangerous character, someone who you wouldn't want to cross.
I'd like to point out that all the descriptive terms you've just used are also descriptive terms for Anakin Skywalker. Arrogant, egotistical, doesn't like the fact that his journey's been wrote for him. He was a prophecy after all. What else did you say? Potentially dangerous. It's all there. It's all there. Was there any stories in particular that inspired Moonflower, or is it very much just this sort of character thing?
It is, and it isn't. It actually, when I describe this story to people, they always tell me, "Go watch The Princess Bride." And I had never read or seen The Princess Bride before writing this. It was just a story that I kind of wanted to tell because I thought it would be really cool if you had a little girl meeting her hero and then discovering that her hero is actually a bad guy.
Yeah, okay.
And she's been looking at it the wrong way. But in terms of tone, a lot of Neil Gaiman stuff has been very inspirational to me, like Coraline and Stardust and all these kind of stories that he does. And I suppose there's a little bit of J.K. Rowling's magic in there, just like discovering a fantasy world. I mean, whenever I write a scene where a character is coming into Vicario Valley, I always imagine like that first time you see Hogwarts Castle, all the things that just come over you. You're like, that's magic. And there's a fun side to that with that. And then, as we know, Harry Potter gets a little bit darker towards the end.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand that. I don't think there's ever been a better, whether it is in book form or in film form, I don't think there's ever been a better character being introduced into a fantasy world than Harry Potter. Even something like the Chronicles of Narnia, you know, perfectly normal human beings being introduced into a fantasy world. I don't think comes close to the sort of impact that Harry Potter has had on the world.
No, and actually, it's funny you compared her to Anakin because I don't know if I mentioned this before. This story is set in 1983. In the summer of 1983.
Oh.
And there is a couple of Return of the Jedi references.
Oh, that's good. Is there a redemptive arc? Don't answer that because nobody will want to read it then if you tell us what the actual story end point is. But
I'll say if you want to know what the answer to that, hit me up on Twitter and try and get a beta reader form.
Yes, do that. Talk about that. What is all that about?
So the writing process is very difficult. You can't just write a story, send it out to publishers, and then expect to be a bestseller within 2 weeks.
No.
You have to go through certain stages, get beta readers, which are like people who will read your story for you, who are just readers, and they'll point out stuff to you like, did they like the characters? Maybe there's one point here that can be improved. And I'm looking for those right now. If you want to be a beta reader and Moonflower sounds interesting to you, go to my Twitter, check out the synopsis, then DM me if you want a form. And the other thing you need as a writer is a critique partner. And I've got one of those, thankfully. She's a fellow writer like myself. Her name's Lexine Higgins. And what we do is we send chapters back and forth to each other. So she sends me her book and I send her mine. And we both kind of help each other in a way. And Lexine's story is sort of similar in that it's a fantasy story as well, but she's going for a more medieval epic kind of feel than I'm going with a more like character-based kind of feel. But she's sent me 4 chapters of her story already, and I've really liked what I've seen so far. And, writing shouldn't be a process that you go through alone, because if you do that, you end up with characters like Moonflower Jones. You need someone who can bring out the best of your writing and point out where maybe the flaws can lie and where you can improve upon that. So I've still got a long way to go with this, but hopefully it should go to plan, because I really feel like this is the story that I want to get out first before any others.
Excellent. I mean, it's clear you're very, very, very passionate about this. That is at Nolan Dean 27 on Twitter. I don't think you mentioned that, but if you are interested in beta reading Moonflower at all, anyone listening to this, but yeah, the passion is clear that you have from Moonflower. It's nice that you've you're working with someone else as well, as sort of a back and forth kind of thing that seems to be helping as well, which I think is great. But I do want to maybe move on from Moonflower a bit, because I know that you just had a short story published.
I did, yeah.
Our good friend and friend of HorrorHouse, former guest on HorrorHouse, Jesus, his show Beyond the Grave. You just had the Ice Princess published as part of a segment on Beyond the Grave, and I've read the Ice Princess because you know that I am a sort of fan of short horror stories. That is my thing when it comes to reading. The Ice Princess is a great story. I really enjoyed reading it. So it was some time ago that I read it now. But tell people what that is if they haven't checked out Beyond the Grave recently.
Well, Beyond the Grave is a great podcast. Jesus not only does like short stories, but he talks about horror movies that have come out, horror movies that he loves, and he does some really funny skits. The Ice Princess was kind of a challenge for me because I'm going to be honest with you. I wrote that story in a day, and I didn't even know if it was. One day. I didn't even know if it was any good. But my thing for that was, with horror, I wanted to play on a fear that a lot of kids go through, and that's the fear of like isolation and being bullied. And there's this little gothic fairy tale element to the Ice Princess that I won't spoil for anybody, but if you like that, go check out Beyond the Grave on iTunes or Geek Pulse Radio. I believe it was 2 weeks ago that episode was on, or just tweet Devon at Jesus12. I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you where it is.
Yeah, I myself was a guest on Beyond the Grave a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, but he's a good friend of ours, and it's a great show that he produces over there. And definitely go and check that out as well, in order for you to listen to The Ice Princess, a wonderfully leaves you thinking gothic piece of teenage psychological horror. What is it about, sort of? I mean, was there any sort of inspirations for the Ice Princess. Obviously, it's a short horror. I know. Obviously, Stephen King is known for more long form novel horror. Is there any sort of short horror writers?
Mostly the stuff that inspired the Ice Princess was creepy pasta that I've read on like Reddit and like Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, but also kind of that Edgar Allan Poe kind of feel is there as well. But of course, the Ice Princess is updated to modern day. It's not set in like Victorian times like his is.
Yeah.
But I wanted the story for that to be sort of a timeless thing. So it doesn't really matter what time period you set in, because a lot of kids get bullied. And that is, a lot of people underestimate how terrifying bullying can be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Obviously, being a writer, you've talked about sort of the need to improve what you're doing. You've talked about your partnership with Lexine Higgins and that whole sort of critique thing you've got going on there. How else do you feel? How else do you feel writers can improve their sort of own work, or how do you go about trying to do that?
So what I do is I try read as often as I can. I try watch movies as often as I can, because that can also give me some inspiration. But the main thing here is a lot of writers where I feel they struggle is that they keep all their books and stories to themselves, and they're too scared to show to anybody, which is understandable, because when you're putting your own work out, it's kind of like, especially for people like us, it's like you're putting your money where your mouth is. If we talk about what we don't like in movies and stories, like, as part of our hobby, really.
Yeah.
So when you're putting your own story out there, that's you saying, all right, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. And you've got to be prepared if people don't like your story. So, but the same token, if you don't put your story out there and you don't show it to people, you're never going to improve it.
Yeah.
And that's a sad truth of writing, but it's a collaborative process.
Yeah. What's the sort of biggest or most sort of impactful piece of advice you've ever had from someone who wanted to help you improve?
Well, from someone I met at Comic-Con, you guys don't know who this is if you know me. He wrote in my little writer's block. It's literally what it sounds like. I have a little book shaped like a block that says writer's block on it.
Oh,
and
God.
This guy told me, read fiction. Fiction is fuel. The more you read, the better you'll write. And the other advice, which I've always gotten, that I've always given to people, if you want to write a story, write the story that you want to read.
Yeah. That's very, very sound advice right there. I think anyone looking to, or anyone who even has it in their head that they want to have, I have an idea for something. Take that advice on board, guys. Go and do it. Like Nolan says, be prepared for people to there's being critical, and then there's constructive criticism, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, being critical never helps anyone, but put a bit of this is how you can improve. Put a bit of that in there. And that's clearly what you're sort of looking for, because you want to write the best story you can possibly write.
Exactly.
Otherwise, there's no real point. I do want to ask sort of maybe what's going to be sort of like a final question type thing, and I'll ask it now. But maybe this is a easy question, but maybe it's quite a difficult one. What does being a writer mean to you? What does the idea of being a writer?
Well, being a writer to me means that you're someone who loves stories. You're someone that loves telling stories, and you're someone who is open to every kind of story. Don't just block yourself off to a certain genre or a certain type of story. If you want to become a great storyteller, you kind of have to look from every kind of angle and see how things change and how they can be expressed in different ways. Being a writer means that you have to develop your own unique voice, which is very difficult considering how many bloody books are published now.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to write something that's just personal to you and be afraid that nobody's going to want to read it, because the best kind of stories that I've read are the ones where you can tell the author is clearly passionate about what they're doing. And there's some stories that I've read where it's like, okay, it's clear you're latching onto a trend and you're just doing the bare minimum. I don't read those kind of things. But another thing I would say, if you want to be a writer, do not bash other people's work, because that will come back to bite you in the ass later on.
That is very similar to what I said 2 minutes ago. Criticism doesn't help anyone, but constructive criticism certainly does.
Exactly, yeah.
Nolan, thank you very much for coming on the Enlightenment Hour again to talk all about writing and Moonflower and all that. Where can people find you if they want to even talk about Moonflower, talk about writing, talk about all the fun stuff you do?
Well, you can find me at Nolan Dean 27 or on my own channel, Nolan Dean. And if they want to talk about writing, I do have something here that might give them an insight, if you don't mind me doing that.
Of course.
This is a little monologue that I've written for Moonflower. Now,
okay, well, listeners of the Enlightenment Hour, be prepared for Moonflower Extract by Nolan Dean.
Right, so the context of this scene is this is where Moonflower has shown her true colors, and once again Millie's trying to get her to remember that she's a hero, and so I decided the name of this monologue should be I Remember, and this is what Moonflower says to her, and it kind of encompasses what her whole character is. Do you want to know what I remember? I remember playing in the grass by myself because none of the other kids wanted to play with the pushy girl. I remember crafting my first bow out of bamboo and my father snapping it because I was too young for such dangerous things. I remember my mother telling me to be more ladylike and be kind to the boys who complimented how I looked, even though I wouldn't go near them with a dirty stick. I remember sneaking out every night to practice archery and sword fighting and having to pretend I wasn't tired the next day so my parents wouldn't hit me again. I remember the night I realized my parents were cowards, and I was the only one willing to stand up to thieves and witches. I remember being trapped in that house like a prisoner, and the relief I felt when I saw it burn to the ground. I remember knowing that I had to make it on my own, and having to beg privileged royalty for a sack of hay to sleep on. I remember being told I was too girly to fight in the Royal Army, even after I'd bested every soldier with my eyes closed. I remember being told to shut up and go to sleep when I knew witches and warlocks were going to kill us if we slept. I remember leading them into battle and being the last one on the field as we slaughtered the enemy. I remember realizing it was all for nothing because the enemy had already poisoned the waters while we slept. Do you want to know what you remember? Reading about that in a cute little storybook.
There you go, guys. An extract from Moonflower by Nolan Dean. One day a very successful publication, I'm sure.
I hope so.
If you, yes, like I said, if you do want to go ahead and support that Nolan on Twitter, at Nolan Dean 27, I'm sure he'll love talking about this to pretty much anyone. But what else have you got going on?
Well, over on our Odd Shape channel, I'm part of Spacetime Rewind, which is a Doctor Who recap show with me and the lovely Kimber Barrett. I just want to say how cool it is to see my own name with the Doctor Who theme in an intro. That's like a little fanboy wish. And this Halloween, you guys know I do video essays. My video essay for the Halloween one, it was a tough choice, but I ended up going with Nosferatu. And it's going to be focusing a lot on another writing thing, how the inspiration for Nosferatu led to its own creation, and that's something that I think helps other writers as well. And my video essays are different, whereas it's not like something like the Nerd Writer where he explores film techniques or anything like that. I'm looking at them purely from a storytelling basis. So if you like those, go check those out.
Yeah, I mean, your video essays, you pick a sort of a topic within those films to discuss, focus on that, and they're always really good, and they have been relatively successful, one would say, in the past. I'm a big fan of Nosferatu, obviously, as though people wouldn't know that. Yeah, I look forward to seeing the finished essay on Nosferatu. But guys, what am I doing? I am still in the midst of the Halloween month return on HorrorHouse, and that will be ramping up in the next couple of weeks before Halloween, with all of those viewer chosen, or listener chosen, I should say, listener chosen films to be talked about from the category of modern horror, and that is over on HorrorHouse, that you can find if you are on YouTube, right on this channel in its own playlist, if you are on Apple Podcasts or Castbox or wherever the internet puts podcasts. Over on there as well, just search HorrorHouse in Apple, and you'll find it there. There is also, of course, plenty more from the Enlightenment Hour going back, and plenty more coming in the future as well. So you can sub to this YouTube channel, that good stuff. Or if you are on iTunes, please leave a rate and review, because that'd help a lot. I'd be really appreciative to anyone who did that, and I'd be friends with you forever, because I like that sort of stuff. You can follow me on Twitter at the PurpleDon, and thank you once again to Nolan for coming on and talking and having this very, very nice discussion on writing and on everything that writing means to people. But guys, as always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.